In Jordan Peele's most recent film, Nope, there's a point when one of the characters says something along the lines of, "In 1 hour you will leave here different," in a kind of meta commentary to the audience. You will likely not leave this particular presentation changed in any significant way, though I do hope that you leave changed in small ways. But I think that's what Timothy Morton's goal was in writing Hyperobjects, which is the object that we will be talking about today. Imagine that you've been dropped into a giant vat of slime of the Nickelodeon variety. This is what I imagined while reading this book and learning about its titular hyperobjects. The slime itself represents the hyperobjects held together by the intersection of metal panels, gravity, screws, the earth beneath it, and a million other tiny little things. The slime itself, the hyperobjects, stick to every part of you, seeping into the nooks and crannies of your body, and struggling against it only entangles you further. But what exactly is a hyperobject, and how do you define it? Morton describes hyperobjects as having 5 characteristics. For most of this presentation, we're going to be using global warming as an example because of Morton's background in ecology. You'll notice I use the term global warming in place of the more commonly used climate change. Morton intentionally uses this phrase to instill anxiety into the minds of who use it, which, while I don't know if I particularly agree with, I will follow suit for the rest of this presentation and for the sake of his argument. So, hyperobjects, they are viscous, meaning they are sticky. They hold on to everything they touch, a la the slime example from earlier. They're molten, and Morton uses this term to describe how hyperobjects are massive and long-lived, so much so that they defy space-time. The example that Morton uses to illustrate this effect is the Earth itself, which is a massive hyperobject, probably the most important hyperobject in our lives. There's a space-time vortex around Earth, but Earth is not contained by this space-time vortex, but rather it creates it. Hyperobjects are non-local, meaning they cannot be understood by the effects they create. So using global warming as an example, it creates 100-degree weather in Seattle. It melts the icebergs. But you can't understand the totality of global warming by experiencing the heat alone. Or experiencing, the wildfires or any of the other effects. It has to be experienced in its entirety, and because it cannot be experienced by human minds completely, that is one aspect of the hyperobject. Hyperobjects are also phased, meaning they occupy dimensions that we cannot perceive. The sun sets and rises to our eyes, but in reality what we perceive is explained by a complex system of orbit and gravity. Lastly, hyperobjects are interobjective. They are created at the intersections of other objects. So global warming again, it occurs when the biosphere meets fossil fuels, meets cars, meets emissions, and a million other things. So let's take a breath. If you're experiencing confusion, you're not alone. I read this book twice, and I still don't fully understand many of Morton's ideas. And it gets a little bit worse before it gets better, but I promise we're going to land somewhere that I think is positive. Another theory worth mentioning that Morton proposes is the idea that the world has in fact already ended. If we haven't already, we have officially crossed into the borderline of science fiction territory, which is probably why Morton is so popular with sci-fi authors. I'll do my best to explain. Morton claims that the word world and its cognates, nature, environment, and so on, implies something in the background at the edge of our lives. Our world ended when carbon emissions began all the way back in April 1784 at the advent of the steam engine, and then again in Trinity, New Mexico, when the bomb was first tested by the Manhattan Project. The world has officially at that point gone from something that we experience on the periphery of our lives to the foreground due to things like global warming. Thus, the world has ended because it is no longer something that we can experience in the background. It is a part of our lives actively. It's a bit pedantic in my opinion, but we'll discuss some of the critiques about this in a future slide. Morton's primary sources are other philosophers and artists. Keats, Kant, Aristotle are a few that are mentioned throughout the book, but two philosophers are of particular note, Alfonso Lingus and Martin Heidegger. Morton cites Lingus particularly for his personal and provocative style, specifically in his work The Imperative. Heidegger is used a little more cautiously. Morton keeps certain ideas, such as Heidegger's tool analysis theory, but pretty liberally discards some of his other ideas that he doesn't like, and that's kind of a through line throughout kind of Morton's ideology. The broader implications of hyperobjects is difficult to talk about because, in a way, hyperobjects are about as broad as you can get. The Earth, our solar system, time, black holes, all of these are hyperobjects. But so are styrofoam cups or the shoes that we wear. The looseness of the definition gives the term flexibility, but that flexibility feels like a limp noodle at times. The point of a hyperobject is that it is vast and unknowable in total. So, in that sense, there are no broader phenomenon than hyperobjects. Whether or not that is useful, we can talk about as well. In my opinion, the most applicable hyperobject to our particular field is knowledge itself. Knowledge is the result of human connection with each other and the world around us, passed down through generations of talking, writing, dancing, and the list goes on. How is this useful? I don't really know. Perhaps understanding the interconnectedness of our world can give us the tools to improve things that we might find irrelevant to the library science field. Civil rights, for example, obviously very important, of course, but how is that related to late fees? On the surface, it doesn't really seem like it could be connected, but people of color are disproportionately affected by poverty in our country and are thus more drastically affected by the consequences of late fees. Reducing access to things that they might need for school or to apply for jobs and stuff like that. So an awareness of the bigger picture can never really be a bad thing, in my opinion, as long as it's directed. And I think we can see that this book is a little bit without direction in certain areas. Morton was largely ignored by contemporary philosophers. Their work was championed mostly by artists and writers who used their work as inspiration. Their ideas were generally well received, with the main detractors commenting on some of the things that we've already touched on. Notably, Ursula K. Heiss wrote on the amorphous nature of hyperobjects, arguing that if a hyperobject can be anything, then it might as well be nothing. For my own personal critique, I tend to agree mostly with Heiss. I like to think that I'm an action-oriented person. Morton's ideas are a little bit too formless and unactionable for my taste. I think that they are very smart, much smarter than me, and I really did enjoy portions of the prose throughout the book, though they do have a tendency to kind of meander a bit. Reading this book made me work out my brain in a very satisfying way. I think I would have enjoyed it a bit more if it was pared down. If you overmix cake batter, the cake will often come out dense and less enjoyable, and this book felt a little bit overmixed. Additionally, the idea that the end of the world has already occurred feels a little bit counterproductive. Morton argues that referring to the world as ended should encourage people to act with haste because we don't have much time left. In my experience, it feels like that means we're out of time. If something is ended, it's broken. And I often think of replacement rather than repair. Though as I write this, it occurs to me that perhaps that's exactly the point Morton was trying to make, and that we should be trying to change our mindset of the distinctly consumerist idea of replacement with something more like restoration. I feel like I could probably talk about this book for hours and not get any closer to understanding, but I hope that this presentation has given you a small idea behind what Morton was trying to accomplish. Much like the meta commentary from Jordan Peele, I feel changed after reading this book. I feel like the hyperobjects are sticking to me, and I've become a little bit more aware about that. For better or for worse, that's yet to be determined. Thanks, guys, for checking out my presentation. I will see you in the discussion boards.